1944. The Pacific War had consumed the world in fire. Japanese soldiers, once loyal to the emperor and hardened by endless battles across the islands, now found themselves in a place they never expected, behind barbed wire, under American watch. For years, they had marched through jungles with little food, eating whatever scraps nature provided. Hunger gnawed at them like a constant shadow. Many had come to believe that capture meant humiliation, starvation, and slow death. But what they discovered inside American prisoner-of-war camps left them stunned. Instead of punishment and deprivation, they were handed something unthinkable. Steaming hot meals, cooked fresh every day. Imagine the moment. A soldier who had chewed on dry rice and muddy roots for weeks, now staring at a tray filled with meat, bread, vegetables, and even coffee. The heat rising from the food wasn't just steam. It was the impossible, a comfort they thought they'd never see again. These men, raised to expect brutality from the enemy, couldn't understand why their captors were offering them kindness. In the form of food, for many Japanese POWs, the first bite of a warm American meal became more than sustenance. It was a shock to the soul, a moment that shattered years of fear and propaganda. It was the moment they realized that captivity in the United States was not a march toward despair, but something closer to survival, perhaps even dignity. This is the story of how hot meals in American POW camps changed everything for Japanese soldiers. Inside U.S. camps, food became a symbol of the unimaginable. The Japanese soldiers who arrived at these camps often did so in silence, their bodies worn thin by months of deprivation. Many had survived on the barest rations. Handfuls of rice, dried fish that had long lost its taste, and sometimes even roots and grasses scavenged in desperation. Hunger had shaped their days and hollowed their eyes. To these men, food was not a luxury, but a constant struggle, a shadow that followed them with every step across the battlefields of the Pacific. When capture came, fear whispered to them that life was about to become even harsher. They believed the enemy would treat them cruelly, that captivity meant slow starvation or deliberate neglect. But when the gates of the American camps closed behind them, something extraordinary began. Instead of cold scraps or cruel punishments, they were handed trays filled with hot meals. The first sight of the camp kitchens was enough to leave many in disbelief. Large steel pots steamed over steady flames, the scent of soup drifting across the air in ways that made their stomachs twist with both longing and shock. Fresh bread, baked in ovens that never seemed to rest, was stacked in baskets lined with cloth to keep it warm. Meat, scarce and precious in wartime Japan, was portioned carefully, but in sizes that still felt generous to men who had grown used to gnawing on scraps. The kitchen staff, often American soldiers assigned to food service, moved with the rhythm of routine, ladling broth, cutting loaves, and filling trays as if it were the most natural thing in the world. For the Japanese prisoners, it was anything but natural. They could not comprehend how their captors, whom they had been told were merciless and brutal, would offer them such comfort. The act of standing in line to receive food was itself a strange ritual. On the battlefield, meals were rushed, eaten wherever possible, sometimes in the rain, sometimes in silence. Here there was order. Prisoners stood in neat rows, waiting their turn, each holding a tray that gleamed under the light. They could hear the hiss of steam from the pots, the scrape of ladles, the thud of bread loaves placed onto plates. Each step forward brought them closer to something they could hardly believe, a plate that held not just food, but warmth. When they finally reached the front of the line and felt the weight of the tray in their hands, many stared at it for a long moment, as though unsure if it was meant for them. To taste that first bite was to feel a surge of emotion that words often failed to capture. A spoonful of hot soup, thick, seasoned, filled with vegetables, sent heat running down into their stomachs like a memory of life before war. A slice of bread, soft on the inside and crusty on the outside, tasted of home, even though it was foreign to many of them. Meat cooked and tender filled their mouths with flavor so overwhelming that some had to pause, eyes closed, as if savoring not just the food, but the idea that kindness could exist in such a place. The disbelief was as heavy as the hunger had once been. Some prisoners ate quickly, shoveling food into their mouths as though it might vanish if they hesitated. Others ate slowly, each bite an act of reverence, their hands trembling slightly as they brought food to their lips. Conversations during these meals were often hushed, carried on in low tones. The prisoners did not know how to reconcile what they were experiencing with what they had been taught. In training, they had been told that capture was dishonor, that the Americans would treat them with scorn, perhaps even cruelty. Yet here they were, eating food that was warm, carefully prepared, and plentiful. The contradiction left many unsettled. They whispered to each other about whether it was a trick, whether this comfort would be taken away as soon as they became accustomed to it. But day after day the meals continued, consistent, reliable, always hot. Slowly, disbelief turned into reluctant acceptance, and then into gratitude that most were too proud to admit aloud. For the American side, it was not necessarily kindness alone that drove this treatment. The Geneva Conventions had outlined standards for the treatment of prisoners, and America, eager to present itself as a nation of law and order, adhered to these rules with precision. The camp kitchens became an extension of this principle. Feeding prisoners well was not only a duty, it was a demonstration of power, of stability, of a system that could provide even in the midst of war. Yet for the Japanese soldiers, the political meaning was secondary. What mattered to them in the quiet of those evenings was the taste of the food, the way it warmed their bodies, the way it reminded them that survival was possible. The transformation was gradual, but unmistakable. Men who had arrived gaunt and withdrawn began to fill out again, their faces regaining color, their bodies gaining strength. Hunger, once their constant companion, slowly released its grip. This physical change was mirrored by an emotional one. Suspicion gave way to cautious trust, and in time, the camp meals became more than sustenance. They became a daily ritual that gave structure to lives otherwise defined by uncertainty. For prisoners cut off from their homeland, the sound of ladles scraping against pots and the smell of bread baking became strange. Comforting signals of stability, there were moments of awe that prisoners would later recount with vivid clarity. The sight of rows of steaming pots, the gleam of trays stacked high, the careful order in which meals were distributed, all stood in stark contrast to the chaos of jungle warfare. They could not forget how it felt to hold food that was warm all the way through, not cold or half-cooked over a desperate fire. They remembered the small details, the sound of bread crust cracking under their teeth, the sweetness of a rare piece of fruit, the way coffee burned hot against their lips, yet carried a taste they grew to crave. Each detail mattered because each was a reminder that they were still alive, still human, still worthy of more than mere survival. And perhaps the most powerful memory of all was the sense of shared silence that often fell over the camp during mealtime. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of men would sit at long wooden tables eating without the noise of battle, without the fear of gunfire. It was a silence that held weight, broken only by the clatter of spoons and the murmur of voices. For men who had lived with the constant roar of war, that silence was as nourishing as the food itself. It was peace, if only for a short while, served on a tray alongside bread and soup. In time, the memory of those meals became inseparable from the memory of captivity itself. Long after the war, when these soldiers returned home, they carried with them stories not of cruelty, but of shock. Shock at the simple act of being fed so well by their enemy. For some, it was the first time they had realized that war could hold contradictions, that an enemy could be both fierce in battle and unexpectedly humane in captivity. And always, the image that returned was the same, standing in line, receiving a hot meal, and feeling for the first time that survival was no longer impossible. The act of eating in these camps carried more than nutrition. It carried meaning. For the Japanese prisoners, each hot meal was not simply a plate of food, but a disruption of everything they had believed. Before surrender, their commanders had drilled into them the idea that capture was worse than death. They were told Americans would treat them as animals, starve them, mock them, and strip away what little dignity they had left. To give up was to accept humiliation. Many of these men had carried that fear in their hearts when the war finally overtook them. Yet every time they walked into the mess hall or lined up at the kitchens, the fear was challenged by something far more powerful, the unmistakable comfort of hot food prepared with consistency and care. Morning began with the smell of coffee. For some, it was the first time they had ever tasted it. The dark liquid, steaming in tin cups, was bitter and strange, yet its warmth spread through their bodies and filled them with a kind of energy they had not known since the early days of the war. Alongside the coffee came bread, sometimes eggs, sometimes porridge. It was not extravagant, but compared to the meager handfuls of rice and dry fish they had eaten while marching under the burning sun or in the rain-soaked jungle, it was beyond imagination. Lunch and dinner followed the same rhythm, hearty stews that simmered with potatoes and carrots, plates that carried meat cooked tender, vegetables seasoned with flavors that reminded them they were no longer fighting for survival against nature itself. It was not just food, it was structure, order, and something resembling normal life. Slowly, the meals began to dismantle the walls that fear had built. Soldiers who once expected cruelty began to whisper among themselves about the strangeness of it all. They spoke in quiet disbelief as they sipped the hot coffee, wondering if this was a deception meant to weaken their resolve. Yet the meals kept coming, regular, reliable, untouched by manipulation. The Americans were not serving scraps to taunt them. They were serving food that even their own soldiers might have eaten. This constancy became a kind of reassurance. It told them without words that survival here was possible, that the enemy they had feared might not be the monster their leaders had described. Around wooden tables, conversations that once brimmed with despair began to soften. At first, they ate in silence, unsure if it was right to speak freely in captivity. But over time, men began to share pieces of bread, to trade portions of food, to laugh quietly at the unfamiliar tastes that made some wrinkle their noses while others devoured every bite. These shared meals rebuilt something within them, something war had nearly destroyed. It was a fragile sense of community, a reminder that they were not simply prisoners, but men who could still sit together and eat like human beings. For those who had been starving in the jungles, the shock of eating fresh vegetables could bring tears to their eyes. Carrots, beans, potatoes, all cooked soft and served in generous portions, were luxuries they could hardly believe. The sweetness of fruit, when it was available, felt almost unreal. Many stared at apples or oranges with a reverence that bordered on disbelief, some hesitating before eating, as if afraid the fruit would vanish if they moved too quickly. To them, these foods symbolized not just nourishment, but the vast difference between the life they had been told to expect and the life they now lived inside the wire. Even the process of sitting at a table with food in front of them became a form of healing. The simple act of placing a tray down, of knowing there would be enough for everyone, was a comfort no battlefield could provide. It reminded them of home, of families waiting around tables that many of them feared they would never see again. In the mess halls, for brief moments, war receded into the background. Instead of gunfire, there was the scrape of spoons. Instead of shouting, there was the murmur of quiet voices. Instead of hunger, there was fullness. Yet the meals also carried with them a deeper meaning, one that reached beyond the food itself. Every plate served was a silent contradiction to the propaganda they had carried with them. They had been taught to expect brutality, and instead they found themselves treated with a surprising measure of dignity. For some, this realization was more difficult to accept than the food itself. It challenged the very foundation of what they believed about their enemy, about the world beyond Japan. Was it possible that the Americans were not the demons they had been taught to fear? Was it possible that their captors had chosen discipline and humanity over cruelty? These were questions no one dared answer aloud, but they lingered in every quiet glance, exchanged over steaming bowls of stew. The effect of this daily rhythm was undeniable. Hunger gave way to strength, and strength gave way to cautious hope. Men who had arrived skeletal and frail slowly began to regain weight, their cheeks filling out, their eyes brightening. Even the way they carried themselves changed. Where once they shuffled weakly, now they walked with steadier steps. Where once despair hung heavy over them, now there was at least the shadow of resilience. Food did not erase the pain of capture, but it gave them back something far more important, the ability to endure. In the long stretches of captivity, when days blurred into weeks and weeks into months, these meals provided the heartbeat of life in the camps. Morning, noon, and evening were measured not by clocks, but by the sound of mess calls, by the lines that formed with predictable patience, by the steam that rose from pots and kettles. Food became a marker of time, the one constant in a world that had been upended. Each meal reminded them that life was continuing, that tomorrow would bring more than just survival. It would bring another chance to eat, to gather, to live, and it was in these quiet moments, surrounded by the clatter of trays and the smell of cooked food, that the prisoners realized something extraordinary. They were not being broken down. They were being sustained. Each hot meal was an act of defiance against their expectations, a daily gesture that reminded them that the world was larger, more complicated, and sometimes more merciful than the war had led them to believe. They came to understand that captivity here was not a descent into despair, but a chance, however strange and unexpected, to endure with dignity intact. For those who lived through it, the memory of those meals would never fade. Long after the war ended, they would speak of the shock of being handed a cup of hot coffee, the strange sweetness of American bread, the way the stew seemed to warm not only their stomachs, but their very souls. And in those memories, the food was never just food. It was survival. It was humanity. It was the quiet, daily miracle that told them they were still alive. For the Japanese soldiers, the hot meals became the most powerful memory of their captivity. Long after the sound of battle had faded, long after the gates of the camps had opened and they had returned home, it was the food that lingered in their minds. Not the barbed wire, not the watchtowers, not the uniforms of the guards. What they remembered most vividly was the taste of American bread, the smell of soup simmering in great steel pots, and the shock of being treated with humanity when they had expected only cruelty. For men who had spent years believing that surrender was the ultimate dishonor, the hot meals became proof that even in defeat, life could still offer warmth, dignity, and survival. The bread was often the first thing they mentioned. In Japan during the war, bread was rare, almost foreign, more a curiosity than a staple. Yet in the American camps, it was everywhere. Baked fresh, served soft, filling the air with the smell of yeast and flour that drifted through the barracks and clung to memory. Soldiers who had eaten rice their entire lives could not forget the strange satisfaction of biting into a loaf of bread, the crust breaking under their teeth, the inside warm and tender. Some would later confess that this bread, more than anything else, symbolized the difference between the deprivation of their wartime experience and the strange abundance of life as a prisoner. Then there was the soup. It came in ladles, steaming, poured into bowls or onto trays. It was never the same. Sometimes it carried meat and potatoes, sometimes beans and carrots, sometimes it was thick and hearty, other times light and clear. But always it was hot, and always it was enough. The men remembered holding their bowls close to their faces, breathing in the steam, letting the warmth sink into their hands before it ever touched their lips. To sip that soup was to be reminded of home, of mothers who once cooked for them, of families gathered around tables that seemed impossibly far away. In those moments, the war receded, and the soup became more than a meal. It became a bridge to humanity, and then there was the memory of meat. In wartime Japan, meat was a rarity, something rationed, scarce, often unavailable to ordinary soldiers. But in the camps, portions of beef, pork, or chicken were served regularly. It was a taste so unexpected that many stared in disbelief at their trays, unsure whether to eat quickly or savor each bite. The flavor was overwhelming, rich and filling, a direct contradiction to the hunger that had hollowed them out during the war. They would speak of these meals not with bitterness, but with wonder, astonished that in captivity they had eaten better than they ever had on the battlefield. What began as disbelief soon transformed into something deeper. The meals became the rhythm of life in captivity, the constant that gave structure to days that otherwise blurred together. Each morning, the smell of coffee told them the day had begun. Each afternoon, the clang of ladles against steel pots signaled that another meal had arrived. Each evening, the silence of the mess hall, broken only by the sound of chewing and the scrape of spoons, reminded them that life continued day after day, sustained by food that warmed their bodies and quieted their fears. In this rhythm, trust began to grow. The prisoners learned that the meals would not stop, that no matter how long the war dragged on, they would be fed. And with that trust came reflection. They began to question the stories they had been told, the propaganda that had painted the Americans as monsters. How could monsters serve them bread still warm from the oven? How could demons ladle out soup that filled their stomachs and gave them strength? The contradictions were too great to ignore, and in time, the food itself became a silent teacher, showing them that the world beyond Japan was not what they had been led to believe. Some of the most poignant memories came not from the abundance, but from the small moments of humanity tied to food. An American guard handing an extra slice of bread to a prisoner who looked especially thin. A cook smiling faintly as he poured soup into a waiting bowl. The simple courtesy of being served, of being acknowledged as men rather than enemies. These small gestures left marks as deep as the meals themselves. They showed the prisoners that compassion could exist even in war, even across the divide of cultures and loyalties. At night, when the prisoners lay on their bunks and whispered quietly to each other, it was often the food they spoke of. They compared flavors, laughed about the bitterness of coffee or the sweetness of fruit, speculated about what the next meal might bring. In those conversations, food became more than sustenance. It became a shared language, a way to cope with the uncertainty of captivity, a way to dream of life beyond the war. The hot meals created not only survival, but also stories, memories that the men carried with them long after the war ended. When they returned home, many of them spoke not with hatred of their captors, but with astonishment at how they had been treated. They told families about the bread, the soup, the meat. They described the mess halls, the long lines, the steam rising from pots as though it were a vision. They spoke of the shock of realizing that captivity had not been the end of their lives, but in some ways, the preservation of them. These stories became part of the larger narrative of the war, tales of survival that contradicted the darker memories of combat. The hot meals, simple as they were, became symbols of something greater. They represented not just the survival of the body, but the survival of dignity. They proved that even in defeat, life could still hold warmth, that compassion could emerge where it was least expected. For many, the food became a reminder that humanity was not entirely lost in the chaos of war. It was a thread of kindness woven through the fabric of conflict, a thread that many held onto for the rest of their lives. In the end, the legacy of those hot meals was not only nourishment, but memory. Memory of the bread that tasted like life itself. Memory of the soup that warmed them from the inside out. Memory of the meat that gave them strength to endure captivity. These memories lingered longer than the war itself, etched into the hearts of men who had once believed that surrender was the end. Instead, in the warmth of those meals, they discovered that even in the darkest of times, there could be light.